Hi, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about labor rights in the Philippines and how trade between the USA and the Philippines could help improve things here. How I wish I could actually speak with you, have a dialogue with you. But in my age, people would normally say that the time difference between us is actually forcing me to say and admit that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So just let me address you through this video instead. Let me start by saying that trade union density in the country is down to a little over 6%. That means that only 333,000 out of 5.29 million total paid employees by collective bargaining agreements. Why? Well, there are many reasons for this. One is the low economic development. Two is contractualization. Three is the trade union repression. And finally, the collapse of labor justice system. Now, most workers are employed in the informal economy. As such, many are not unionized. Of the 48 million, only a little less than 6 million are paid employees. The rest are on various other forms of employment, self-employed, unpaid family workers, etc. But the biggest hindrance to trade unionism in the country is contractualization. In the Philippines, we have the right to join or organize unions after working for 1 day. But if you are a contractual employee, you will not dare exercise this right for fear of having your contract rescinded, or it will no longer be renewed. This is why there are millions of workers who have been working for years, decades even, in the same company, but are still not considered as regular employee and therefore not able to form unions or join one. And I should mention, the government is the biggest employer in the country, and it is also the biggest violator of security of tenure. Many workers today are misclassified as non-regular employees because they are agency hired. Some companies would even have workers that are employed in various manning agencies. When they try to organize unions in their own manning agencies, they would find themselves unemployed as the principal employer would simply end its relationship with the agency in question. Those working in the gig economy, particularly delivery riders, are classified as independent contractors. Despite recent court rulings pointing out the fact that these independent contractors are actually employees of the platform, asserting their rights remains a serious challenge. When they try to organize unions, they would be off-boarded, meaning they can no longer access their apps, or shadow banned, meaning they can continue to access their apps, but they do not receive any orders. We have cases where union leaders are actually permanently suspended by the platform simply because they led actions against the platform. On top of that, you have trade union repression. Now let's talk about trade union repression. Mr. Duterte, during his term, launched a war against political dissent with the bloody war on drugs as the background. Now, during that time, he formed the NTF-LCAC, or the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict in the Philippines. Now, and its aim is to wage an all-of-nation approach to eradicate the communist insurgency, which easily spilled over to the labor front as unions, irrespective of their ideological persuasions, were treated as enemies. Now, employers made use of the climate of impunity created by the war on drugs as an opportunity to rid themselves of pesky unions in their own companies. So there is really a reason why the Philippines has been tagged as one of the top 10 worst countries in the world by the ITUC Human Rights Index for the past 7 years. Trade union killings, red tagging, abductions, harassment, and other forms of violations of freedom of association are being perpetrated on the workers in the Philippines in a very systemic manner. From 2016 to 2023, we in the labor movement have documented 69 killings of trade union leaders and organizers. 69. 3 key cases of abductions and enforced disappearances involving 5 individuals. 41 cases of arrest and detention on trump-up charges. 111 cases of workers arrested during strikes and protest actions, 90 cases of forced disaffiliation, 58 cases of red tagging or terrorist tagging, 127 cases of threats, intimidations, and harassment, and finally 19 cases of other anti-union activities. Now, it is very easy to be desensitized by all these numbers in a context where the war on drugs have massacred anywhere from more than 6,000 people that the police admits, or 30,000 people that human rights NGOs in the country have asserted. It is so easy to forget that behind these numbers are actual people. So let me tell you some stories. Lando Abangan, a young Centro and Partido ng Manggagawa organizer from Cebu, was one of the first to be gunned down in 2016 when the madman Duterte came to power. He was very vocal in opposing the war on drugs being waged in his community. One morning, he was gunned down just a few meters away from his home by a masked man. We heard rumors that it was his very own neighbor, a close friend, and a police asset who was forced by the police to act as the gunman. That gunman himself was found dead weeks later in a creek. Fe and Marlon Ornido were very active and deeply committed community leaders in Quezon City. They were both assassinated inside their home in 2021. The reason? The husband and wife team were leading a very successful campaign against land grabbing by a corporation. I also personally knew Leonardo Escala, or Ka-Esca, who I worked with when I helped develop his union's education program. He was the president of the union in the International Container Terminal Services Incorporated in Manila, and he was shot dead on February 7, 2021 in Manila. The latest death, Alex Dolorosa, a paralegal officer of the BPO Workers Union in Bacolod, was found dead in a chicken coop with more than 30 stabs 3 days after he was reported missing on April 21. The sad part is, none of these assassinations have been given justice. Out of 69 cases, only one, the case of Manny Asuncion, who was one of the 9 activists killed during the so-called Bloody Sunday in 2021, reached the prosecutorial level. In 2022, the Department of Justice decided to file murder cases against 17 policemen who were involved in his killing. But when the Marcos administration came, the new Secretary of Justice junked all these charges for insufficient evidence. Now, if you think that is bad, wait till you hear the fact that all these documented cases that we submitted to the ILO high-level tripartite mission did not actually include all the cases of trade union murders that we in Centro suffered. In 2021, Nolvin Absalon, a Centro leader in Masbate Island, which is an island in the middle part of the country called the Visayas region, together with his brother Keith, were both gunned down by the New People's Army. Now, the New People's Army is the armed wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines. When an IED failed to kill both of them, the NPAs walked up to them and blasted their faces with rifles. The NPAs later said it was a case of mistaken identity. Killings are really bad. It is designed to sow fear among workers. But the fear of being killed, of being subjected to various forms of harassment, has a far more insidious effect. It creates a chilling effect that makes workers think twice about joining the union, much less leading its formation. That's why red tagging is a favorite tool of the Anti-Communist Insurgency Task Force called NTF-ELCAP. Now, red tagging is the act of publicly branding individuals, groups, or institutions as affiliated to the communist armed groups or terrorists. This is done by security forces without presenting any evidence at all. In many areas in the country, being red tagged sends the signal to all rogue elements, especially the paramilitary and anti-communist groups, roaming around in the countryside that you are an open season. It is, in fact, the prologue to all forms of intimidations. All those killed that I mentioned earlier were red-tagged before being killed. Just last week, the US ambassador to the Philippines asked me, is red tagging ideologically or economically driven? I said both. The paranoids who are in the NTF-LCAC are obviously driven by ideology. For them, if you criticize the government, then you must be a communist. But for the employers who reach out to the NTF-LCAC to get rid of the unions in their companies, well, clearly they are driven by economics. Now, Coca-Cola is a good example. In 2020 to 2021, Coca-Cola would call for town hall meetings. And in these town hall meetings, they will invite the NTF-LCAC, which in turn ends up red tagging Centro. When we asked the Coca-Cola management to denounce the red tagging, they merely washed their hands and said that, well, it actually doesn't have anything to do with what the NTF-LCAC has said. That is really bad. Now, what happens after being red tagged? Well, after being red tagged, security forces sometimes, with the aid of the local government unit, would talk to our leaders and union activists to tell them that Centro is a front organization of the Communist Party, as well as of the New People's Army. And then they will urge our leaders to disaffiliate from Centro. This would then be followed by home visits. It actually gets worse. In Surigao province, for example, this one now is in Mindanao, in a mining company, one of our leaders who was red tagged by the military ended up hiding for months after the security forces raided his home and tried to plant guns and explosives as evidences for illegal possession of firearms and explosives. Well, they failed. But even if they failed, our leader was so afraid that he had to run away. It does not help that we have a hopelessly corrupt criminal justice system, from the police to the prosecutors to the courts, that practically makes it all but impossible for workers to obtain labor justice. Now, all this forced the labor movement to call on the ILO to send a high-level tripartite mission way back in 2019. That's ILO's second highest level of investigation. The ILO requested the government to invite the mission way back in 2019, but the Duterte government dragged its feet until such time that COVID-19 lockdowns came. Thus, the mission managed to finally visit the country only last January this year. Interestingly, the government was severely ill-prepared. They had very discordant voices. On the contrary, we in the labor movement, despite our differences, were so organized. As such, we got what we wanted. The ILO high-level tripartite mission called on the government to end FOA violations by working with its tripartite partners to establish a presidential commission, investigate the killings, and strengthen existing mechanisms that would investigate and monitor freedom of association in the country. However, the government is now dragging its feet when it comes to enforcing the recommendations of the mission. It is even trying to cherry-pick the recommendations, and that is another problem. Can we actually address these things? Yes, but we in the labor movement need help. We need leverages. And that's where trade policies, particularly GSP and GSP Plus, comes into play. Now, we in the labor movement, particularly Centro, are critical of free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties, especially those that are designed to further advance the neoliberal agenda of liberalizing the economy, privatizing public services, and even deregulating industries. These FTAs and BITs have become hard laws, meaning laws that are readily enforceable at the national and global levels. But labor rights, like human rights in general, remain as soft laws. They are unenforceable at the global level, and they are weakly enforced at the national level, if they are at all. This is why many unions, especially in the global north, are advocating for labor clauses in FTAs and bilateral investment treaties or BITs. Now, while we remain skeptical about these things, there's one area of trade policy that we know works as a leverage if it is used properly. And we are referring to the GSP policy of the USA and the GSP Plus policy of EU. In 2009, as the Arroyo regime was waging a total war against its perceived enemies, including the trade unions, we effectively made use of the GSP complaint mechanism to force the government to invite the ILO high-level mission. We filed a case with the help of the ILRF, and we argued that the country's GSP benefits should be withdrawn or at least suspended until such time that the government can prove that the GSP benefits, according to it by the USA, would actually redound to the benefit of the workers. That GSP complaint, hand in hand with the Human Rights Bill, which was then filed, then threatens to cut off military assistance to the Philippines, was actually very effective leverage for us. It led to a whole host of labor reforms that led to drastic decline of killings in the country. We'd like, once again, to make use of it. This is why Centro, together with other labor groups in the Philippines and allies in the United States of America, together with the help of course, of the ILRF, filed a new GSP complaint in the US. At the same time, we are now looking at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, as another possible leverage. Recently, there was an agreement that the President Biden and Marcos Jr. signed when they were in Washington, D.C., where they committed themselves in establishing a U.S.-Philippines Trade Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA, and in it, a joint labor working group would be established. Jointly with the AFL-CIO, CWA, and other labor groups in the U.S., we agreed not to participate in this joint labor working group until the Philippines have demonstrated seriousness in addressing the violations of labor rights in the country. These are just some of the things that we are working on to force our government to respect workers' rights. And this is where you guys can help us. Thank you very much for listening to me.